The NAR settlement surrounding buyer broker compensation is set to go into effect on August 17th. Here we are in the beginning of July, and there is so much that we don't know or understand about what the changes will look like when it does go into effect. Now, all we know with any real certainty is that they really want to see that listing agent and buyer agent compensation is negotiated independently of one another. The other thing we know with somewhat certainty is that you can no longer list cooperative compensation in the MLS. Now, even though the compensation is no longer allowed to be listed in the MLS, the seller is going to be allowed to pay the buyer agent comp from net proceeds. Now, I wanted to take a look at this from the seller's perspective and how it may impact them after the settlement goes into effect. So when you think about, what's really your seller's priority, there's a number of different things that are going to come into play. They might care about a quick sale. They might care about minimizing their costs. They might be thinking about convenient timing. But at the end of the day, the single biggest factor for most sellers is they want to get the highest price for their home so that they can maximize the net proceeds that they walk away with. So let's take a look at how net proceeds are impacted by the buyer agent comp being paid both ways, seller and buyer. So let's actually say, for example, in this scenario, we have got a sales price of $505,000. Seller has outstanding mortgages about $276,000. Buyer agent comp currently being paid by the seller through net proceeds. And let's just assume for simplicity's sake that it's a total of $24,000, $12,000 to the listing agent, $12,000 to the buyer agent. What that means is the seller is going to walk away net proceeds of about $205,000 in this scenario. Now, what we're talking about is the seller no longer paying that $12,000 for the buyer agent comp. So that goes from $12,000 to zero. Now, if you're the buyer, that's probably going to impact what you're willing to pay for the property. So they're going to offer you probably $12,000 less than if you were to pay that $12,000 for them from net proceeds. So let's say the sales price or the offer price drops down to $493,000. Now your payoffs are going to stay the same at $276,000. Your buyer or your seller agent comp isn't going to change. That's still $12,000. So your net proceeds still remain at that $205,000. So when you look at it this way, it doesn't really seem like there's any real impact to you as the seller. But let's take a deeper dive and take a look at this from the buyer's side. So the buyers, actually, when we're talking about buyers, we're really talking about their cash to close. So in a situation where you've got a purchase price of $505,000, a 5% down payment on that is going to be $25,250. Their closing costs are going to be $8,124. And then their prepaids are going to be roughly $5,212, give or take. That's going to actually give them a cash to close about $38,586. Now let's actually move to the seller not paying the buyer agent compensation. Now, as we talked about before, because they're paying it out of pocket, they're likely going to reduce their offer amount. So offer amount gets reduced to $493,000. Their 5% down payment is $24,650, which only is a savings of $600. So nowhere near the $12,000 reduction in seller paid compensation or seller paid compensation. What does actually happen is their closing costs go up. So their closing costs are going to increase by that $12,000, meaning that instead of $8,124, the buyer's closing costs are now $20,124. Their prepaids are going to stay the same at about $5,212. So now their cash to close totals $49,986. That's an increase of about $11,400. Now, if the buyer has that additional cash on hand, no problem. Now, as we know, the biggest obstacles for home buyers is saving enough for down payment and closing costs. In this instance, let's say the buyer only had $40,000 saved for down payment and closing. This is something that I hear really, really often. Just go out onto social media. You'll see it posted by agents, sellers all the time. If they're short funds to close, why should the seller step up and cover that fee? Well, one, if you really think about it, they're not stepping up and covering that fee because the buyer is paying a higher purchase price in order for the seller to pay that from net proceeds. So really what that does is it enables the borrower to finance that into their mortgage rather than come up with it in cash. So if we know that our limiting factor for the buyer is cash to close, say 40 grand. Now the scenario as it is today, their cash to close at a purchase price of $505,000 would be $38,586. So we want to keep that the same. All right. Your prepaids really aren't going to change. Your closing costs really aren't going to change. The only thing in this scenario that can really change to keep your cash to close below $40,000 is your down payment. So in this instance, to keep that number at $38,586, that down payment has to drop from $25,250 all the way down to $13,250. Now, the real impact to that is the maximum amount this borrower can then offer for a property. That number in this instance would be $265,000. Now, as a seller, you're thinking, okay, well, they're just not a buyer for my property. Well, that's okay when you have enough buyers in the pool to meet your price. But as buyers shrink down and you're refusing to pay buyer agent comp through net proceeds, so not even really out of your pocket, but out of proceeds from a purchase price they've agreed to, all right, you're ruling all of those potential buyers out, and those are going to be fewer people that are bidding on your property because they simply do not have the cash needed to close at a purchase price as high as $505,000. So just something to think about as you are talking with your listing agent and thinking about, will I offer to pay buyer agent compensation or will I refuse to pay buyer agent compensation? Now, the reality is nobody knows what that compensation is going to be. What I would say is be open to it in negotiations and understand that for many buyers to offer what you want to receive in terms of a purchase price or a sales price on your home, you're being willing to pay that buyer agent compensation through net proceeds will in fact mean that more buyers can offer you a price that is closer to your magic number. Hope you found this helpful. My name's Andrew Adams, and I am the Mortgage Navigator.